So our first presenter is Vasilis Volakakis. Vasilis is a fourth-year PhD candidate specializing in civil and environmental engineering with a focus on transportation systems analysis and planning. With a passion for interdisciplinary collaboration, Vasilis thrives on connecting with individuals from diverse disciplines and backgrounds to exchange ideas, knowledge, and insights. His approach emphasizes not only technical expertise, but also the continuous evolution of leadership skills and their application, reflecting a commitment to fostering understanding and innovation in the dynamic field of transportation systems. So, Vasilis, if you want to go ahead and take over.
Sir, thank you so much, and
Okay.
thank you everyone for being here on a Friday morning. I'm sure you have other stuff as well, so thank you for your time. Carl, my only request is to keep track of the time in case I go above the 20 minutes, which I will try to keep track of. And oh, two,
Even like a
perfect.
5 minute warning if you want.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
Right.
So today's presentation it goes by the name of strategic vertiport placement for airport access, utilizing urban air mobility for accelerated and reliable transportation. Um, so basically, this is and before I go to the outline, it's an idea of a working paper about urban air mobility, and I will go a bit into what is urban air mobility and all that crazy flying taxis and God knows what. But like before getting into that, like a quick outline, we will start with like a general overview of the idea and the work motivation behind it, some introduction into the modeling framework, some results, and a few conclusions, limitations, and some future steps. And at any point, please stop me if you have any questions of any nature. So to begin with, advanced air mobility refers to the next generation of aviation technologies that integrate air mobility solutions into urban and regional transportation systems. It includes a variety of aircraft types, such as eVTOLs, those like electric vertical takeoff and landing, and STOLs, which are short takeoff and landing aircraft, designed for both passenger and cargo transportation. And urban air mobility is a subset under the umbrella of advanced air mobility and focuses specifically on intracity transportation, especially for passenger movement within urban areas. And vertiports are basically essential infrastructure which they facilitate takeoff, landing, parking, and refueling and recharging of those aircraft. So the work motivation is that airport-bound trips are a significant part of total ground transportation, and especially in areas with large airports, where traffic congestion can complicate fast and efficient access and ingress, of course. The focus is the strategic placement of those type of facilities to basically improve access and ingress trips. The objective is to optimally allocate those facilities to maximize accessibility and demand coverage while minimizing operational costs. And this framework was applied in the Chicago metropolitan area, identifying various trade-offs between coverage, accessibility, and cost of that type of infrastructure. Yes, I had the visualization. Now it's late anyway. So moving into the modeling framework, there were two problems that were considered, a capacity facility location problem and a maximal covering location problem, which was slightly adapted from how it's usually found into the literature. And basically, the capacity facility location problem finds optimal locations for facilities, considering both facility capacity and cost constraints. It minimizes the capital and operation facility costs while ensuring demand requests are met, and incorporates capacity constraints, ensuring that facilities can handle demand within some thresholds. And the maximal covering location problem basically focuses on maximizing demand coverage subject to constraints on the number of facilities and the service capacities. And the adaptive formulation includes capacity constraints again and the emphasis on the capacitated formulations were given due to the fact that an uncapacitated facility location problem is not so realistic while compared to the capacitated version. And the solution methods that we wanted to try and compare to see how they can solve those problems are a capacitated K-means algorithm, a greedy heuristic, and a mixed integer linear programming formulation for the maximal covering location problem. So starting from the capacity facility location problem, the objective function is to minimize the sum of the opening costs and the service costs for all facilities and demand requests under the constraints of demand coverage, in which we ensure that each demand request will be served by at least one facility. A facility can only serve demand if it's open. Capacity constraints and the budget constraints, which basically regulates the number of those vertiports that you can allocate into your network. And the next thing is the adapted maximal covering location problem, with the objective of maximizing demand covered while giving high priority to demand in congested areas. And this was another part of the adaptation of that formulation. And basically, that veta I is a priority weight for its demand point, which reflects on congestion in this case or other factors as well. Under the constraints of ensuring that the number of facilities that are open do not exceed an upper bound or a budget, if you wish. A demand node can only be served by a facility if the distance between the demand node and the facility is within a specified service radius. And again, capacity constraints, which ensure that each facility's capacity is not exceeded. And by capacity, we basically mean the service rate or the hourly or daily operations that a facility can handle, which is basically how many aircraft you can have taking off and landing within an hour, for example. And that depends on many parameters. So in terms of the solution methods, on the left, it's a very simple flowchart of the capacity K-means, which is nothing more. It's like something super simple. It's a very simple K-means algorithm with the only difference that it incorporates capacity constraints. And the greedy heuristic, again, it's a very simple. It's nothing crazy. It's a very simple formulation. And basically, you define a lower and an upper bound on the number of facilities, which is defined by the user and by the whatever assumptions you want to make. You have a set of candidate locations of those potential facilities, which is coming from the K-means algorithm. And then you iterate through possible facility numbers, starting at the lower bound and increasing by one facility at each iteration. And for each iteration, you solve the capacitated facility location problem with the current number of facilities you have, and you evaluate the solution using the objective function you have defined. And the objective is to balance demand coverage with operational costs. And if the total cost exceeds the available budget, which is basically the number of facilities, this will be adjusted to the closest possible value within the budget. And if a better solution, lower cost or better coverage, or a combination of two is found during an iteration, it updates the best solution found so far, and the process repeats until no further improvement can be made, and the best solution is returned. And if the upper bound is reached and unserved demand points still exist, exceeds a specified threshold, the budget constraint may be relaxed to allow more facilities. And the next thing should be, why did it stuck? Perfect. Yes, analysis. And before like jumping into the results and the analysis part, the main idea was to test three different, it's not even families of solution methods, three different sets of solution methods, and basically have a very simple clustering algorithm, a greedy heuristic, and an exact solution method to see which one of the three can provide better results and solutions for such a problem, to basically try and see which family of solution methods can be applied in such a setting and such a problem. In terms of data used, the data was collected for trips bound for O'Hare Airport and Midway in Chicago using bus, rail, taxi, and ride-hailing service data. Ridership and network structure from like multiple transit agencies that focus on bus and rail routes that serve those two airports were considered. It was assumed that 7 to 12% of total daily ridership correspond to airport-bound trips based on typical transit usage patterns for airport access and egress. And the Chicago data portal was extensively used for taxi and TNC trips data. And to give you an idea of we defined our demand for a trip to be an urban air mobility service trip, for example, and to be eligible for that. The only two the criteria were that it has to have a minimum travel time of 40 minutes or above and a minimum distance of 17.5 miles, which are all based on the literature on advanced urban air mobility. And yeah, in terms of the congestion data, regions with significant ground congestion were identified using congestion estimates again by the SCAO portal. And the capital cost per vertiport was estimated at 7.6 million with annual operating cost of 2.4 million. I'm slightly good on time. So starting from the capacitated K-means, we found that most solutions achieve a reasonable average travel distance. An average travel distance is basically a measure of accessibility, if you wish, to see what is the average distance that a person or a demand point has to travel to gain access to an urban air mobility service. And for example, that like the closest to that demand point vertiport. But however, some present high maximum travel distances, and basically you have a lot of outliers, and basically you have a lot of demand points that have to travel a long distance to gain access to such a service. And K-means assigns demand points based on spatial distribution, but capacity may prevent some clusters from serving all nearby demand points, potentially increasing travel times and travel distances. And since K-means it's a clustering algorithm and does not have a service radius constraint, it facilitates the facilities that are found may not be optimally placed to minimize travel distances, potentially reducing overall accessibility and leading to higher maximum travel distances. And on the right, there are some graphs that shows a sensitivity analysis in terms of average travel time and demand coverage and maximum travel distance, my apologies, and demand coverage, and a set of Pareto frontier solutions on the bottom side. In terms of the greedy heuristic, there are different trade-offs between demand coverage, number of facilities, and travel distance. And some solutions achieve over 90% coverage with low travel distances, offering an efficient facility placement. And coverage up to 98%, yes, I'm not forgetting my English yet, can be reached, but either with more facilities and lower capacity per facility or fewer facilities but higher capacity. And again, capacity is your hourly operations. And the literature is all over the place because this is yet to be an actual transportation mode. So there are all sorts of assumptions about the number of aircraft that you can have taking off and landing at the airport at a given time. But then you have safety aspects and everything. So it's a very tricky place to have assumptions and be optimistic about that. So anyway, in terms of the candidate locations, and we like run a sensitivity analysis to see if the number of candidate locations has an impact on the solution. And having from 22 to 30 candidate locations were found to be sufficient for good solutions. And going beyond 30 candidate locations did not significantly improve coverage or accessibility. On the right, again, you see a set of Pareto frontier solutions on the bottom right, and above that, a comparison between the average distance traveled and the coverage and the maximum distance and again coverage for different scenarios. And you see that like a very simple and like reasonable assumption that as the operations per hour go up, the number of facilities can go down, which is reasonable. And at the interest of time, I will jump on the adapted maximal covering location problem. And basically here we saw that the mixed integer linear programming for that specific problem provided the most flexibility in scenario testing in terms of capacity, service radius, and number of facilities. High demand coverage was achieved while maintaining low average and maximum travel distances, which prioritizes accessibility. a 2 mile service radius resulted in over 90% demand coverage with an average travel distance under 2 miles. And uh, increasing capacity from 30 to 40 hourly operations led to a 25% coverage increase. Carl, I think I'm on my 5 minute mark almost. Keep an
Yep.
eye on me because I
You're
might
right,
go
right on.
above.
5 minutes right now.
Perfect. Thank you. Further, going from 40 to 50 hourly operations resulted in an additional 10% increase, bringing total coverage above 90% with an average travel distance below 2.5 miles. And going from 5 to 7 vertiports increased coverage by 10% and going above the total 90% of the band coverage. And with 10 plus vertiports, coverage exceeded 95%, but it showed diminishing marginal returns beyond that point. And again, 20 candidate facilities were sufficient for optimal solutions, with 30 plus facilities offering little to no additional benefit at all. And from the Pareto optimal solutions that you will see on the next slide, 90 to 96% coverage could be achieved with a service radius of 3 miles, a moderate capacity, 65 to 70 hourly operations, and 7 to 10 vertiports, an average travel distance below 3 miles, which is an acceptable, potentially acceptable accessibility measure, and maximum travel distances also below 3 miles. And here you have some comparisons between service radius, capacity, and number of facilities versus coverage and accessibility. So you basically see how the demand coverage and the average distance change while you change the service radius and you keep fixed the capacity and the number of facilities. Then you have as a variable the capacity, but you keep fixed the other two parameters. And my apologies for those graphs. I definitely have to find a better way to show how its solution changes in terms of demand coverage and average distance. But this was the best way that I could think of. And on the bottom side, you have the 3D comparison and the Pareto frontier of all the solutions that were compared, that were tested. And this is the Pareto front with its solutions details in terms of capacity, radius, maximum distance, and the standard deviation. So you see how the 3 dimensions change and what you can get in terms of coverage with less or more facilities, etc. So a few conclusions and limitations. UIM integrates those eVTOLs and STOLs into urban environments to provide faster and reliable transportation, with vertiports being the essential infrastructure for that operation to happen. Strategic placement of vertiports is crucial to the success of urban air mobility. I will jump on the limitations and future steps because I will definitely run out of time. So one of the main limitations and also future steps is the fact that we are only considering one single vertiport type, but in reality, you can have different types of vertiports depending on budget and all sorts of things like safety and all that stuff. So this is one thing that I need to point out. And the second limitation, and again, future step, is that we need to integrate special restrictions such as existing infrastructure, land use, safety regulations into the model to make it more realistic and implementable, and some other like future steps. But I will stop here. Thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions or comments at the end, please, by all means. And again, thank you for being here. I appreciate it a lot. And some references with the wrong background. And before I forget, the background idea I said every time, it's Nadim's trick, and thank you for allowing me to steal your presentation trick. So I will stop sharing, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Vasilis. I'm going to open it up to the group for any questions. Please feel free to speak them or put them in the chat.
I'm happy to hop in. So thank you, Vasilis. Great presentation. Cool to see your work, like work that I know that you had been doing, but didn't really know anything about. So one question I may have missed. So the locations that you're looking to serve, which are basically like in one of the models, at least basically the two airports in Chicago area.
Mhm.
So those would be like, let's say like these hubs, let's say. For do do you assume that there are vertiports at those locations that are uncapacitated? In other words, they can receive all the trips that are routed to them?
This is a very good question. We thought of like different ways to implement that, and like some cases we run them as those only two locations as uncapacitated, and the rest of the locations in the Chicago area as capacitated. But then it was like more realistic to also assume that they would have capacities, of course, because like mainly safety regulations and everything. So it was found that you might need more vertiports on those two specific areas to serve all the demand, the incoming demand, than on other Chicago area like locations. So you can approach. I don't know if I'm answering to your question,
Yeah.
but you can approach it by either assuming an infinite capacity or by being like more realistic and saying that you will need 3 or 4 vertiports instead of
Yeah.
one to serve the demand. But it was found that for here, one vertiport with a moderate to not very high capacity assumptions can serve a daily demand of those 6,000 trips per day, which is a moderate to low
Okay.
scenario case. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for the
Thank you.
question,
No,
sir.
no, and your assumption makes sense. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so question.
Oh, hello.
That was a great presentation. Thank you so much. I'm curious about the capacitated k-means algorithm.
Mhm.
Is it, I believe you may have mentioned it somewhere. It is much slower than the ordinary k-means. And how are the results different? Like how tight are the capacity in your formulation?
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for being here, sir. I appreciate it, and it's great to see you. The different, like first of all, as you like very accurately pointed out, it's way slower than the usual k-means that you would have, and like it's nothing more than saying that each cluster can have up to a certain number of demand points, and that's it. Like this is the constraint that you assume, and the difference is mainly because like you will see a better in terms of optimally finding the clusters than the simple k-means, but you will still have a suboptimal, or it's not an optimal solution like to begin with, but it's better than having like a simple k-means in some cases, but in some other cases, like with a high demand, for example, and if you have tight budget constraints, you will see some differences that doesn't make sense in terms of like facilities allocation because of the fact that you have demand points that are not served, and you have to reallocate your facilities to serve all demand points. I don't know if I answered or if I went to
Yes.
3 different things again, but yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions for Vasilis? All right. I have a quick one that's not really on the content. It's on a very early part of it.
Sure.
How did you come up with the minimum travel time and the distance threshold for the trips that you considered?
Yes, this is a very good question. The literature has all sorts of different like assumptions in terms of after which point of travel time and distance it will make sense to shift from the ground to such a trip, because it will be an expensive service. So you have to somehow compensate for the cost with the travel time savings, and like a lot of like work in the literature has found that like usually above 45 to 50 minutes and beyond of a trip, of a ground trip, it will correspond to significantly enough travel time savings and value of time savings to make sense to shift from the ground to the air. And also like distance wise, that 17.5 miles like threshold is a pessimistic but like a realistic I would say threshold that I found like based on the literature. Yeah.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Sure.
All right, I'm gonna get one more. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, we will move on to our next speaker. Let's do it. So first,
I'm off the hook.
thank you, Fawzi.
Again, thank you everyone. I appreciate for being here. Thank you.
All right, our second speaker today is Fawzi Khalife. Fawzi is a passionate advocate for human-centered engineering, dedicated to ensuring that engineering practices serve individuals, societies, and the environment. With a strong commitment to sustainability and equity, he continuously seeks to advance best practices in engineering through education, research, and professional work. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree in civil engineering from the American University of Beirut and recently completed his PhD in civil engineering and construction management in 2024 from Colorado State University. His research focuses on social equity in transportation, exploring how equity is defined, measured, and integrated into transportation systems and asset management practices. Through his work, Fawzi aims to bridge the gap between technical engineering solutions and their social impacts, contributing to more inclusive and sustainable infrastructure development. So thank you so much for being here, and I will hand it off to you to present.
Thank you, Cal, and thanks to the organizers of this event. It's a pleasure being here, and thanks for having me. So let me start by sharing the screen, and then we'll go from there. Alrighty. Can you see the screen? The presentation?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so this has been my research for the past 2.5 years almost. It's about social impacts and social equity in transportation asset management specifically. And so now I'm presenting part of this research, which is some of the recommendations that we got from the professionals and after analyzing all the data that we collected. And I'd like to also thank my advisors, Dr. Osbeck, Dr. Atadero, and Dr. Arneson for helping on this project as well. So asset management is basically, this is a nice picture from the AASHTO website, which is the Transportation Asset Management Guide. So they have this picture showing some of the assets. So this is a sector within transportation that deals with maintaining and operating all of the transportation assets. Basically, mainly it was pavements and bridges in the past, but now it's more about any asset, including pedestrian infrastructure, transit infrastructure, signals, lights, and so on. So this is part of work funded by the US DOT, and it's been published. It was published like a few months ago in September, and I'll share the link for this report towards the end of the presentation if you'd like to check more about the results, the discussion, and so on. So just to quickly start with a small definition, a quick definition of equity, since it's sometimes understood differently in different contexts and in different projects. So the US DOT had adopted this definition of equity, which is a bit generic, but it works. It is the consistent and systematic, fair, and just and impartial treatment of all individuals, including individuals who belong to underserved communities. And then the definition continues to also list specific examples of underserved communities. For example, main example include low-income communities and historically marginalized communities. In transportation specifically, it's about the fairness and distribution of benefits, which are basically the mobility and accessibility resulting from all these transportation systems around us. And this is a nice picture on the right, like shows the difference between equality and equity in terms of transportation. Like, there's the picture with the books and people standing on it. This is in terms of transportation and the bikes. So the purpose of this research and specifically this presentation is to present some of the recommendations by transportation asset management professionals and transportation professionals on how to integrate equity into this field. All right. So to do that, the study included two big steps, which are the interviews and the surveys. So we did a set of interviews, and I'll explain more about that in the next slide, with professionals working on equity in transportation generally, not specifically asset management, since there's not much done in asset management related to social impacts and equity. So it was kind of reasonable to go and talk to other people working in transportation equity, not just asset managers, and learn from the lessons and their experiences on integrating equity in transportation, specifically in transit, in planning, and in active transportation. We then also did, after the interviews, we did a survey study with asset management professionals, whether they do or they do not do equity and transportation, to ask them and understand how do they approach social impacts, community engagement, any equity-related steps to integrate equity into asset management. We collected all the transcripts, the responses, and analyzed those, looked at the experiences, the expert opinions that the professionals shared with us. And then we analyzed these also in relation to available literature and like recent reports on equity and the social impacts of transportation. Based on these transcripts and responses, we developed a couple of recommendations and like lessons that we learned from these transcripts and responses. And today I'll be sharing the definitions and the recommendations related to defining equity and measuring it in asset management. So for the interviews, we interviewed professionals, transportation professionals from different organizations. One side of the organizations are like DOTs and MPOs, and on the other side, we had community-based organizations. We also interviewed people from cities and counties to include like different levels of transportation planning, not just at the state or the regional level, but also at the local level, which is also a big part of equity-related work in asset management. The interviews were about 1 hour, sometimes 50 minutes, 40 minutes, depends, and were conducted virtually. And this is, in total, we had 20 interviews with 29 professionals. Some of the interviews were group like interviews. So some of them represented cities, others represented DOTs, and so on. All right. For the surveys, we also used like a similar approach, but more on the side of DOTs and MPOs in terms of asset management professionals. So again, for the interviews, it was transportation professionals working in equity in general. For the survey itself, we focused on asset management. So we retrieved some of the email addresses from these websites. In total, we had 700 email addresses retrieved, but the responses are like, it's not here, but it's like 70 responses, okay? And those were collected about a year and a half from now. So most of the participants were from DOTs and MPOs, where like most of the asset management work is being done, but also in cities and like counties as well, but like less work is done over there. So in terms of experience in asset management, more than half of the professionals or the participants in the survey had more than 10 years of experience in TAM, which is good, and shows that like most of them have actual experience in asset management. While in equity, some of them, like about half, had no like experience in equity at all, or had less than 2 years of experience in equity, which also makes sense because not everyone in asset management is going to be working with equity or so. And it was kind of expected. In terms of priorities, so we asked the participants to rank and share with us what are the challenges related to equity when they try to integrate equity into asset management. So on top of the list, it was measuring equity in the asset management field in terms of asset conditions, impacts of managing assets, like how to measure equity, what's something that could be used to measure equity in a measurable way, right? To measure equity, I mean in numbers, not just fairness and helping the communities and disadvantaged communities and so on. And the other, okay, 1 second. Okay. So the second one was about funding, and the third one was about defining. In terms of funding, we will not focus on that today, but we'll focus on the measuring part and the defining part. And that's where we can contribute, right? As researchers, we can provide asset management professionals with metrics on how to measure equity in TAM and how to define it. So from the interviews, one participant highlighted that equity is similar to sustainability and resilience. It's a concept. So unless we define it, we cannot actually measure it. And since it could be defined in several ways, right? There is geographic equity, there is racial equity, there is gender equity, and then social equity. What does that mean in terms of what populations do we focus on in terms of including certain measures into the life cycle assessment of assets or life cycle assessment of projects and so on. That's why it's important and for practitioners to define equity first in order to measure it. So I wanted to just highlight this quote to show the relation between definition and measures. So jumping forward, since time is limited, we're gonna just present this adjusted definition for equity in asset management. And this is also based on the interviews and the surveys. And it's mentioned in the report that I'll share with you in the next few slides. So you can also check more details and discussion about it and how we developed it. It's a bit long, so bear with me. Not this one, but there's a couple parts. So the first part says that social equity TAM, transportation asset management, assesses both existing and future assets through the lens of community needs and their impacts on various populations. So in this first part, we wanted to highlight that any discussion about equity should be based on community needs, right? And then the second part highlights the necessity of community engagement. So in order to understand community needs, we have to go out there and ask communities, what do they want? What do they need? How is the transportation system, the transit system, the sidewalks condition is working for them, and what could be improved, what could be done differently, and so on. Because not everyone, if we are the people here in this Zoom meeting are deciding on the side of communities, will be biased according to our experiences. Let's say I prefer bicycles over cars, or I prefer cars over transit. So this is not gonna work for everyone, right? We have to go out there, engage communities, and ask them what do they actually need. In terms of equitable TAM, the practice, it should integrate social equity into all aspects of asset management, which is basically investment decisions, resource allocation, maintenance strategies, which I'll talk about in the next few slides, in order to ensure equitable distribution of benefits and burdens of transportation assets. The last part is about assets, asset managers should recognize that certain practices affect and can impact disproportionately, can impact underserved communities in different ways. So let's say low income communities might be impacted differently by a pothole if it's in their neighborhood more than if it's in a richer neighborhood or so on. So these impacts should be considered in the evaluation and management of assets. So this is kind of the full definition that we suggest to be used and modified based on the certain needs of the DOT or the MPO or the city. In terms of indicators, so after also analyzing all the data that we had, we categorized the indicators that the professionals shared with us into two big parts, mainly user-related and system-related. There's the other two, I'll talk about those. But first, user-related indicators talks about like how to like specify which communities we're gonna consider in the equity analysis, right? In terms of disadvantaged communities and so on, and how to measure the community needs and the social impacts of, let's say, bridges, pavements, sidewalks on communities. The second set is system related, which is basically the benefits and burdens of managing assets. And it talks about like how, let's say, accessibility is measured, how mobility is measured, how travel time is measured, and so on. Other equity indicators also include staffing and contracting. So there has been a lot of talk about like how to include equity into the staffing and contracting practices, especially at the asset management as well, like not just other sectors of transportation. And there's also budgeting, like how is money distributed across, let's say, a state, rural versus urban? Is it just based on population? Is it actually based on needs? And that's important. That's an important discussion to have, right? Because apparently there's a lot of equity issues still ongoing. There has been a lot of recent reports showing that lower income communities or minoritized communities have been are being also still ongoing, like are being impacted more by, let's say, lower quality of roads, lower quality of sidewalks, and so on. In terms of approaches, I know the time is limited, just a quick note on that. So we asked them, like the asset manager in the surveys, which approach do you think it's maintenance approach? Which one do you think it's like more adaptable to include equity? And although there is no one answer to that, the majority chose condition-based, which is the life cycle approach to integrate equity into TAM, right? Because the life cycle approach can account for different measures that we discussed. A considerable amount also mentioned that there is no relationship between TAM and equity, which is also interesting, and like it shows that asset management professionals still think that like equity or social impacts are like separate from asset management practices, right? So we need to bridge that gap and the equity part and the social part. Finally, that's all. There's so much more details into this, but like this is the main part related to defining equity and measuring it in asset management. For the full report, please check this QR code. It's online on the USDOT website. And please let me know if you have any questions now. We can also have a discussion on that. Thank you, everyone. All good.
Yes, Pablo, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Fawzi, for the very nice presentation. I do have a question.
Yes, please.
So I think that you raised some important points in terms of gaps of how these decisions ought to be made in practice at the level of when basically agencies are actually allocating funds. And so I'm curious if you guys also have some prescriptive suggestions, I want to call them. Essentially, have you guys, in addition to identifying some of these issues and metrics, have you identified like kind of a framework in terms of like the order in which some of these things ought to be pursued, or like kind of essentially how to make sure that when allocating resources that some of these concerns that you identified are actually addressed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Professor. So since the discussion on equity is a bit complicated, to say the least, and then it is also context-based, right? So let's say the needs of people in New York are different from the needs of people in Virginia, different than people in Texas, and so on. When we were trying to list these prescriptive like recommendations and discussion on about equity and indicators, it was kind of hard to like go into specific metrics to say how to measure these. But in the report itself, we highlighted some of the available tools by USDOT and other organizations as well, and private organizations, that like there is so many like now USDOT tools, and the EJ tool could be used, that could highlight like metrics or maps of regions that need more focus, right? That's in terms of the geographic focus. In terms of the budget, I think it's up to the organization itself to bridge that gap, because we cannot specify for them like which communities are the priority. It's gonna be based on the state itself, on the city, and on the community needs, right? So it's a bit hard to specify, like, let's say we're gonna start with hopefully with the low income people, right? Because usually those are the most impacted all over the, like, it's a common thing all over the world. But not always. And how to also, let's say, prioritize non-car users or car users, rural versus urban, and so on. I
Let
don't
me
know. I
ask
don't
just
want
a
to.
very, very quick follow-up
Yeah.
related to what you just said, like a 5-second follow-up, which is did you identify some best practices, like even taking into account that the context in which different agencies operate can be entirely different?
Yeah, that's right. So we highlighted in the report that these equity like indicators uh, might look different based on the level of government and the community needs. So yeah, it is a bit different in that context. Yep. Yeah.
Are there some agencies that you think are doing a very good job?
Yeah, we have seen like a couple of good equity tools and equity indices from Oregon DOT, Minnesota DOT, California DOT, and even New York. They have really a good equity work being done. New Jersey, I think they also have a good job being done. Yeah, so those are like top five, I think. Yeah. I hope that answers the question. Like I know it's not very specific, but it is what it is. Yeah. Thank you, Professor. Any other questions?
Fawzi, so nice to see you again. And thanks for presenting your work.
Thank you, Adrian.
Yeah, so I just had like a, maybe it's like a comment, and just to see like what maybe if something along these lines came up in like the interviews, or like in some of like what your understanding of this is. So it feels like equity can sometimes be put at odds with the way that a lot of like these agencies carry out their analyses in terms of like producing a cost benefit analysis. And so they want the cost benefit analysis to be, as favorable as possible to justify the investment needs. And so when you, let's say, produce the cost benefit analysis, you see that the benefit for repairing sidewalks of a wealthy community might be much higher because the property values are higher, or because, X, Y, Z other monetary valued reasons. Did you get any reactions from like I guess individuals that you interviewed or agencies in terms of like how they are thinking about balancing those maybe like competing objectives?
Yeah. Yeah, so thank you for the question, Adrian. And yeah, that we got a couple discussions on that. So, and the sidewalks example is one that came up really like a lot of times, So, because it is a problem. Sometimes there is discussion about like investing in higher income communities to improve the sidewalks and make them look prettier, while in the lower income communities, the discussion is about having a sidewalk or not having a sidewalk. So that's why it's important for the organizations and cities and DOTs to like highlight these priorities, right? So we're gonna start with improving the pavements or the sidewalks where they are not available. And then we're gonna start by making them look nicer and cleaner and whatever, right? But there's a priority. So, and it's important, but that also there's a lot of politics into that, right? If there's a representative from area 1, which is higher income, and area 2, which is lower income, and then the decision becomes there becomes like a dispute about how to distribute those taxes. And this is also always, there is a discussion about like taxes being distributed, where should it be distributed? Is it equity or equality, you know? So that's a problem. Another thing that I now remembered since you brought up the point, it's like the equity approach towards, let's say, EVs, electric vehicles now. So there is EVs and there is the tax incentives for EVs, right? The 6,000, 7,000. But who is actually using these? It's like middle income to higher income people, not lower income people, because they cannot actually afford a Tesla or whatever electric car. So when we think about equity, it can go into any of these discussions: life cycle analysis, tax incentives, distribution of benefits. So yeah, I hope that helps answer the question. Yeah, it does come up in a lot of the benefits, burdens, distribution analysis. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah. So just to highlight one thing, that equity does not necessarily need to be its own metric. It could be a part of any of these transportation metrics: accessibility, mobility, budgeting, whatever, right? And in asset management, it's the same, or they're like sidewalks, transit, lights, even, you know. I hope that helps.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Cal.
Are there any more questions from the group?
And I'd like to thank also Vasilis for his presentation, and even equity could be integrated maybe into drones in the future, like how it's serving those communities, the delivery time, safety, and whatever, you know, other metrics that could be used in those analyses.
Absolutely. Like this is a great point, and thank you so much for your kind words. And like my very, how can I say this? Like accessibility measure of like average travel. Like this is something very, simplistic, but like incorporating something appropriately on equity as you described it, it's a great next step, and it will be needed because like uh otherwise, you will just have a service for the people who can afford it, which is not,
Exactly,
it's
yeah.
the opposite of equitable. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you for, now that I got the chance, thank you for your presentation.
Thanks.
As
Yeah,
well.
of course. Thank you.
Thanks, Vasilis, and thanks, Fawzi, for two excellent talks. I think that it was a very nice session.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. And it's nice to see you, Jesus. I think you're going to be presenting in the coming weeks, if I am not mistaken.
Yeah, thank you for the invite. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and hopefully we'll see you next month.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.